Thanks, Josh. So, when thinking about kind of the theme of this particular symposium, I'm going to take a particularly memory-based perspective because I'm a cognitive neuroscientist who studies learning and memory. And so, this is the typical slide I give for my in any colloquium talk I do, and I like to think about the constructive nature of memory, right? That our memories aren't really just for retrospection, as we've seen across a lot of these talks. Really, what the brain is doing is trying to build adaptive representations that allow for the most efficient prediction in new scenarios. And so, what are the mechanisms that allow us to build those kind of representations that allow for prediction? And so, some of the points I'll make on this slide kind of echo, I think, general themes across all of the talks that we've seen the past couple days. And so the first is that our past experience certainly guides how we learn in the present. And so, an example from the past couple days is that, right, Jeff gave a memory talk this morning, and a lot of the themes that I will talk about and a lot of the processes and computations I'll talk about were brought up in Jeff's talk. So, take a couple seconds, reinstate what Jeff told you this morning, and that potentially will help you interpret what I'm going to talk about today. And one of the major things I'm going to focus on is the idea that by relating our past experience to our present circumstances allows us to extract information about both commonalities in our world, so regularities of the environment, but also importantly differences, things that might allow us to segment our worlds at its joints, as Jeff said. And so in doing this, by forming these kind of knowledge about commonalities and differences, we can build these mental models. In my particular subdiscipline, we like to use the word cognitive maps. That hasn't been used, I think, yet. But there's many terms, right? We've heard them, like event models, mental models, like situational models, latent causal variables. Those are all kind of different terms that I think represent the same kind of conceptual idea. And the idea is that by bringing to mind past experience during new learning, we can form knowledge that goes beyond our direct observation. We can code relationships among different event elements or episodes themselves that allow us to know more than what we directly learn. And this is really where maybe our maximal flexibility in our representation comes from, right? Building these representations that allows us to make new decisions and to generalize what we learn from one situation to another, right? So I'll give you a little toy example, which is directly related to some of the experiments I'll talk about. So if we think of this, we think about the individual events we experience as building blocks of our knowledge, right? So imagine that you're leaving your house one day to go to work and you see this gentleman walking this dog, and you might think to yourself, because the house next door to you is recently for sale, you might think, this guy must be my new neighbor, right? And so later, you're taking a walk through a park and you see this woman walking this dog. And so one thing I'll point out that's kind of universal about all of our experiences is that they often share content, right? So in this case, the dog is our kind of our overlapping content cue. And what that particular cue does is it allows us to actually reactivate our prior experience with that, right? So when you're walking through the park and you see this dog being walked by this woman, you might actually retrieve, either automatically or intentionally, information about the first time that you saw that dog being walked by the man. And this active reactivation might shape how you learn about the new event, right? And so one way it might do that is it might allow you to pick up on commonalities, right? So you might represent this information as overlapping, right? And that has the benefit of allowing you to form these connections between things that go beyond your direct experience. So you not only represent the shared relationship between the man and the dog and the woman and the dog, but you also code a relationship between these two things that you've never seen before. And that might allow you to do inference, right, in new ways. You might be able to infer that this woman is your new neighbor, so she has a link to the house next door. So when you have a misdelivered piece of mail, that you can return it to either of these individuals, even though you've never seen this woman in your neighborhood, right? So that's like one way that past experience can shape new learning. At the same time, we can have an alternative coding strategy, right? The idea here is that we might separate these distinct experiences to emphasize their differences, right? And so what that would be beneficial for is interference resolution and allowing you to recall the individual details that differentiate these two events. So when I ask you when you first met this woman, you would be able to accurately identify that you saw her first in the park and not in your neighborhood, right? That's the kind of coding that would allow you to differentiate the kind of detailed information. And so I'm going to start out by my talk talking about work by a former graduate student in my lab, Meg Schlichting, who's now at Toronto, about how we actually learn, or how the brain, where in the brain we learn about commonalities and differences through these reactivation mechanisms. And so the paradigm we use is very similar to the man-woman-dog experiment, except we use these kind of novel 3D shapes because we don't want anybody to know anything about these stimuli before they come into the experiment. And so in this experiment, people just learn about the relationship. So they'll learn this blue object goes with this black one, and then they'll later see this black one again with a new blue object. And so they see many of these trials, and we also give them a surprise test about their inferential knowledge, about the indirect relationship between this green object and the blue one. And the idea here is that they might think about the green object while they're learning about the overlapping pair, and how that influences whether they separate these kind of object representations from one another, or whether they integrate them and make them more similar. So how do we do that? So what we actually do is we scan people when they view the individual objects before they learn anything about them, as well as, again, after we teach them the associations, right? So they just see these objects 2 times before and after learning. And the idea is we can compare the neural representations and how they shift as a function about learning these overlapping associations. And so the idea here is if we look at, for this green one, we can get a pattern of activation during the pre-exposure phase and the post-exposure phase and compare it to the pattern of activation elicited by its indirectly related associate here, as well as the ones that it shouldn't share a relationship, right? And the idea is that if they're being separated, what you'd see is a decrease in similarity, right, after learning, right? So they become pushed apart and less similar in neural space. Alternatively, you could see regions that might integrate, where this similarity between these 2 items becomes greater after learning, right? So the idea is that you are coding these commonalities. And so we searched in the brain for regions that do either a separation or integration, and we actually found complementary circuits, right? They're with different biases to treat the same information and represent them differently. So the green regions here are those that showed increased similarity after learning, and that includes the anterior hippocampus here and the posterior ventral medial prefrontal cortex. In contrast, posterior hippocampus and more anterior region of medial PFC tend to afford these separate representations. So, kind of thinking about these, they might reflect independent and complementary circuits that emphasize different coding strategies to support different kinds of behaviors. So these regions that are focused on integration allow us to extract these commonalities. They might help form these schemas or contextual models of experience. And the idea is they might be particularly involved in a conceptual abstraction away from the individual elements that you experience. At the same time, you have these dual codes that represent the distinctiveness among events. And so that allows you to maintain these detailed informations, but also allows you to overcome interference, right? Okay. So the next thing I'll talk about is whether these kind of representational change measures are dependent on reactivation. So if we're thinking about kind of the toy real-world example I gave you, right? The idea is that you think about the man and the dog when you're experiencing the woman in the park. And does that reactivation actually influence whether you form these integrated or separated representations? So this is work by a current graduate student in my lab, Robert Moeller. And so he took a very similar approach to what Meg did, except we used slightly different stimuli. We pre-exposed a bunch of object, face, and 3D, scene, object, and face and stimuli before they learned about overlapping associations, and they saw them again as individual stimuli at the end of learning. And so again, we can take a similar approach and compare these neural representations after learning from their initial elicited neural patterns. But in this case, the stimuli that we used allowed us also to quantify reactivation. So whether they're thinking about a particular scene or a particular place while they're learning about the overlapping association. And so this is kind of based on some other work that we had previously published. And the idea is that can we relate the degree to which people reactivate content when they're learning about overlapping memories to the degree of representational change that we see after learning. And so here, I'm just showing you the regions that show evidence for reactivating prior memories during learning of new overlapping content. It includes some visual as well as parietal regions. And then, we did something very simple for this study. We actually just did a median split on trials based on their level of reactivation. So we separated activation in this entire network about whether it was kind of in the stronger half of trials or in the weaker half of reactivation trials. And the logic of this particular analysis is that we wanted to look at reactivation-dependent separation, so brain regions that showed separation when there was strong reactivation, but not so much when there was weaker activation, and the opposite. So when you see high reactivation, do you show integration, right? So the idea is that, in response to this kind of prediction error, right, one might say, what did different regions do in response to that? And so what we actually did is, this study was a high-resolution study looking at the subfields of the hippocampus, and we actually show a dissociation. So areas in the dentate gyrus and the CA3 region of the hippocampus, when you see strong reactivation of prior memories, they tend to separate that content from one another after learning. In contrast, the CA1 region does the opposite. When you see strong reactivation, it actually leads to integrated representations in this study. And what I'll point out is that this particular dissociation was predicted by a computational model developed by Anna Shapiro. So it's actually built on the complementary learning systems model, except that was developed by Jay McClelland, except it has different representations for the different subfields of the hippocampus, and in particular the monosynaptic pathway from entorhinal cortex to CA1, and the trisynaptic pathway that involves the entorhinal cortex to dentate to CA3. And she simulated this task as well as some statistical learning tasks, and she found in this model, right, that the CA1 representations were picking up on regularities, whereas the CA3 actually showed this kind of aggressive pattern separation. And so we're showing here empirically that that happens in the human brain, right, confirming some of the predictions developed from these computational models. Okay, so that suggests how we form these kind of very simple, right, indirect links between things that go beyond our direct experience. But obviously, we're able to extract a lot more from our environments at different levels. And so the next data I'll tell you about is new data from Neil Morton, which kind of looks at this hierarchical representation about the relationships among events. So not just event elements, but events themselves. And so to kind of help understand what we're going to do in this study, I'll give you another real-world example. And we call this like extracting representational geometries. So the idea here is that let's say that you're flying into Nashville, right, to give a talk at Vanderbilt. So you land at the airport and you take an Uber, right, to go to Vanderbilt, right? So you have this kind of trajectory in the spatial world that you directly experience. And that later in the evening, your host takes you downtown Nashville to have dinner, right, and drinks. And so when you're returning, and maybe your hotel's down there too, and so when you're returning right to the airport, you might have already kind of inferred this trajectory, right? This thing that you don't directly experience, but you have a general sense of where the airport is relative to downtown. Right, and so this is the idea that you, again, what we just talked about, you can infer relationships of locations within a city. But what the next level that I'll talk about is the idea that you can use these geometric relationships to learn to and apply them to new cities. So here's Austin, where I'm from. And so the idea is that you can take this relational structure that you learned in Nashville, right? The idea that airports are far away from downtown, or far away from universities, but universities tend to be close to downtown, and that might be applied, right, to your and make predictions when you go to Austin about where things will be located in that city. And so the idea is that you can learn these relational structures that might allow you to generalize abstract properties across different events at a scale beyond what I've already shown you. And so to do this, to look at these things, again, we use this very simple task where we learn these overlapping associations. And I'll just break this down a little bit, right? You can learn a first-order relationship between something you directly experience, so A goes with B here. And so that would be similar to taking a trajectory, right, from the airport to Vanderbilt. You can also infer the second-order relationship, which I had already shown you evidence for how we behaviorally and neurally we do that. But the idea here is that you might be shared structure across these kind of overlapping triads, right? What we call them. The idea that these geometric structures are shared across these three linked elements, and that they might allow you to learn about a kind of more abstract relationships between them. And so to do that, we can take these and I'll plot you a theoretical voxel space. We can take these kind of representations and what the patterns they elicit in the brain and relate them to one another. So the things you directly experience, the inferred trajectories in the neural space. But the idea that we're hypothesized is that these representations might have similar geometric structures across the triads. And this parallels work going on in Stefano Fusi's lab using monkey electrophysiological data to look at similar kind of geometric relationships and things like reversal learning. And so here, to spell out the analysis strategy we take, the idea is we're going to focus on these indirect relationships between A and C. And if we focus on one, right, we can train a classifier to recognize the vector space that determines how far away in representational space A is for C for this particular triad. So that's not only the distance, but the direction, right? So it's the entire vector space. And then we can look at a different triad and we can basically say where's A in that representational space, and we can add this vector to it, right? And make a prediction about where we think that's corresponding C should be and compare it to the actual neural representation to see if these kind of vector spaces transfer and tell us anything about the hierarchical structure. And so that's indeed what we do. We do searchlight analyses where we take the representations of C, we subtract out the relationship for A for some of our triads, and we get this kind of vector space that determines their relationship to one another. And then we can take that to a new A element, and we add that predicted vector space to get where we think that corresponding C should be. And so we look for regions in the brain that actually show this kind of representation. And you're not going to be surprised that I'm going to show you that basically hippocampus and PFC regions do this. So again, a very similar anterior hippocampal region, MPFC and orbital frontal cortex show these kind of shared geometric relationships that go beyond the individual elements to represent more abstract properties, even within these kind of simplistic experiments that I've shown you. Okay, right? And so you might ask, does this kind of organization, this kind of abstract hierarchical organization, confer any sort of behavioral advantage? And so it turns out that our individuals in this experiment actually show a lot of differences in the degree to which they have this representational geometry. And so here's a person where this is an actual individual subject's multidimensional space for these stimuli. The A's are in hollow circles, the C's are in dark circles, and you can see that there's a relative consistent trajectory between the A and C items in this person's brain. Other people don't have such a kind of well-organized space, and so we can characterize people based on how organized their representations are and relate that to behavior on our inference task, so how well that helps them make these inferences between these second-order relationships. And it turns out that the more you actually have this kind of third-order structure within the hippocampus, the faster you are at answering these inferential conditions. So there is a behavioral advantage to kind of forming these kind of abstract relations across these episodes. Okay, so I highlighted the role for the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex in forming what we call these cognitive maps within these kind of simple associative memory paradigms. But I'm going to emphasize that this is not specific to just these kind of associative memories. We have shown similar things. I don't have time to talk to you about all of this today, so I'll just highlight kind of the ideas that we also show similar regions being involved in forming hierarchical representations through navigational experience. So people traverse through VR worlds, and we watch how their object representations that they experience in those actually are warped as a function of that experience and actually impacts behavior days later, biasing decisions in new ways. We've also actually looked at this in the domain of time using a lot of the kind of the temporal topography networks that Danny talked to us about this morning. And so again, these two regions are involved in representing these kind of temporal maps of space. And importantly, again, in this study, we show that they actually promote reasoning behavior, so that it predicts how people induce properties or do inductive inference. And so we've also showed this in the conceptual space, and I'm actually going to focus for the rest of my talk on our work on how these kind of hierarchical representations represent concepts, in particular to highlight the role that attention plays in forming these kind of cognitive maps. And so this is work that I've done in collaboration with the former postdoc Mike Mack, as well as Brad Love, who's at UCL. And so the first kind of point I'll focus on is whether we see object representations that are updated dynamically according to changing conceptual relationships with one another. And so in this study, we have people learn about bugs, right? And they learn to classify bugs. And so they have, we'll pay attention to 3 features here. They differ on the dimension of legs, they have different antennae, and they have different kinds of pincers. And so one of the problems we have them learn is a very simple kind of category problem, where it's basically a unidimensional rule, where if you have fat legs, you're in one category. If you have skinny legs, you're in another category. And so this kind of just represents the kind of multidimensional space that would allow you to kind of segregate those categories. Our participants also learned to categorize these bugs with a more complicated rule, the XOR rule, which is a conjunction of 2 features, the antenna and the pincers. So if you have fat antenna and this scoopy pincer, you're in the same category as the kind of scissors pincer and the thin antenna. And so again, the category structure here is represented in this kind of space. And so people actually learn these problems via feedback, and they learn them sequentially, but the counterbalanced order. So some people learn the unidimensional rule first, some people learn the XOR rule first. And the idea is that the stimuli are the same, right? But as the problems change, they have to dynamically update their conceptual space to reflect the new relationships among the stimuli. And so what we actually do is we fit behavior with a model that's been developed by Brad, which he calls SUSTAIN, and don't ask me what the acronym stands for because I can never remember. And so this is a clustering model, and so it has an attention layer which sets basically attention weights for each of the features. There's a cluster layer that represents kind of, you can think of as the knowledge, and then there's a probabilistic decision layer, and I'm going to focus on these 2. So we fit the model to each participant's behavior, and at the end of learning, you can pull out the attention weights of the various features, right? And so for the unidimensional rule here, you can see that they pay attention to a single feature in these kind of triangle plots here. And for the 2-dimensional problem, you can see that their attention weights are equally distributed across the other dimensions. What we really care about is how the stimuli activate this kind of cluster layer at the end of learning, right? So at the end, when we fit the model, we can see which kind of patterns of clusters each activates in the model. So we kind of get a vector of cluster representation, and we can make these similarity matrices for each of the stimuli in the experiments about how similar their cluster activation is to one another. And we can do that after learning the 1-dimensional rule or the 2-dimensional rule, and they have very different matrices, right? Because the relationships between the stimuli change as a function of the problems. And so the idea is that we take these kind of hypothesized psychological models that are fit from the model, and we look at where those are instantiated in the brain, right? What represents these stimuli the way that's predicted by the models. And so what we find is that the anterior hippocampus actually represents attention-weighted concepts, and they are dynamically changed as a function of the task demands. And so here I'm actually showing the projections of the actual response in this region, and you can see the response in this region for the 1-dimensional rule fits the kind of predicted structure where the similar category items are on the kind of cube faces, and then they're separated along the feature 1 dimension, which is legs here. And the pattern of response for the XOR rule represents kind of the diagonal planes through the cube. Right? What we also show is that hippocampus is actually engaged with prefrontal regions early in learning, right? So during this phase, when we can see the maximal change in their behavior, we see increased activation between the anterior hippocampus and medial prefrontal cortex, as well as orbital frontal cortex. And so we think that this, in our work across many different studies, we think that medial prefrontal cortexes play an important role in tuning the representational space within hippocampus, right? It's helping to pick out the features of the environment that are most important for the task and emphasize hippocampal encoding on those features, and helping to organize relations within that structure according to the goals and features of the environment. And so specifically, what we hypothesize is going on, right, is that learning is actually dimensionality reduction that's mediated by these PFC regions. And so in the context of this task, the way to think about it is we actually have a variant here. We have where they learn the one-dimensional rule, which I already talked to you about, the XOR problem, and then a higher dimensional rule, which they have to actually learn 3 features to be able, all 3 features differentiate the stimuli from one another. And the idea here is for a low complexity problem, you can compress a lot of the information. You only need to maintain information about feature 1 to be able to distinguish the categories. In a higher complexity problem, you have to maintain more information to be able to distinguish the features, right? And the question is, right, do you see this kind of neural compression as a function of learning? And so we took a pretty simple approach to actually addressing this question, where you just searched for regions in the brain. We took each of the doxals and submitted it to a principal components analysis, and we pulled out the number of factors that explain 90% of the variance across trials. And from that, we basically inverted it to produce a compression score. And so the hypothesis here, right, is that at the end of learning, if we have the low complexity problem, you're going to see the highest neural compression. That means you'll need fewer factors to explain 90% of the variance. For the high complexity problem, right, there's going to be less compression, right, because you need to maintain more of the feature space. But importantly, we expect this kind of representation should emerge across learning, right? It shouldn't be there from the start. You have to learn about the features, the environment, and which things are there. And so that's what we actually searched for, is regions that actually show this kind of interactive pattern, actually weighted by people's performance. And what we found is the only region in the brain we found is medial prefrontal cortex that shows this pattern of response, which we show neural compression varies as a function of problem complexity. And so, the next question we ask is, how does this relate to behavior, right? So does it actually predict anything about how people behave in this task? And so, and particularly, what we wanted to look at is attentional strategies. So the idea that these kind of neural compression should relate to how people attend to the different features of this task. So again, I'll go back to the model. The idea is we have these feature weights from sustain, and we have a different set of feature weights for each of the kind of complex problems. And so this is the actual feature weighting from our participants in this study. And so you can see for the low dimensional rule, again, they tend to have, right, the most attention to a single feature here. For the XOR rule, their attention is to these 2 features, and for the highest complexity problem, right, you can see kind of equal attention weights for all 3 dimensions of the problem. And so you can characterize this kind of differential distribution of the feature weights by calculating attention entropy, which basically the idea behind entropy is that when you have an equal distribution across the feature weights, you actually have the highest entropy. More selective attention to a single feature results in low entropy scores. And so the idea here is that you can relate, right? So here we have, again, this is entropy, average across subjects for each of our problems, the low, medium, and high. And so you can see increasing entropy across the complexity of the problem. This is the degree of neural compression averaged across our participants in MPFC. And so you can see the most compression for the low problems and the least compression for the high problems. And the question is, do these actually relate to one another? And so here I'll show you in a cross-subject analysis, but we've done this within subjects as well, trial by trial, fitting attention entropy to the degree of compression on any given trial. And what we see is that MPFC compression, the more you compress, the lower the entropy. So the more you're selecting one feature and attending to that feature itself, right? And so we think that, right, this is playing a really important role in how we actually allocate our attention and how attention influences hippocampal encoding strategies. Okay, I'm really going to be quick, you guys. I just a few take-home points, right? So, some things that one major point, right, is that these 2 regions, the hippocampus and medial prefrontal cortex, learn about commonalities as well as differences in the environment, right? Cognitive maps are not just about kind of integrating across similar dimensions, but also segregating things based on their differential features, and that those actually affect the kind of hierarchical representations that these regions form. And that these kind of hierarchical representations allow for kind of generalizations of experience across dimensions. So, and here, I've showed you in a couple of cases where it supports reasoning behavior, but we've shown other kinds of tasks and generalizations performance as well. And that, these kind of cognitive maps are really goal related, right? They are focused on whatever your goals are in the environment, and they're domain general, right? So they do this kind of coding across many disparate domains of experience. We've only looked at, I can't say about auditory, but many different domains of visual experience, I should say, and task experience. And that, critically, what's going on is that learning is occurring through this kind of dimensionality reduction process, right? These cognitive maps, what ends up being commonalities and differences are really being goal-directed dimensionality reduction. And I should have left it in, but I don't have the slides here. But one thing that we're really interested in, you guys can ask me about if you want, is that my lab studies actually how these processes develop during childhood and adolescence. So both of these structures, the hippocampus and the medial prefrontal cortex, actually have a very protracted developmental trajectory, and their connectivity to one another it continues to develop until about the age of 25. And so we expect that these kind of mechanisms that allow people to form and organize or pull structure from the environment continue to develop, right, all the way through the college years and the third decade of life. And so we have some kind of data showing that the dynamics by which these regions reactivate and represent knowledge differ at different age points. And so with that, I'll thank you guys for your attention and take any questions you have.